Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. Our guest today is Cynthia Arnson. Cindy is director of the Wilson Center's Latin American program, and she joins us with an update on the latest from Venezuela, where the crisis continues. Cindy, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, John. Delighted to be here.
So the latest news is all about this humanitarian aid that is stuck at the border in many cases and trying to make its way into the country. First, give us an update on that. What's the latest?
Well, the latest is that the Venezuelan government continues to refuse to allow this humanitarian aid in, says that there is no humanitarian crisis, that whatever problem Venezuela has been caused by the United States and U.S. aggression. And the aid is blocked. The opposition said that the first shipment of humanitarian assistance that included vitamins and medical and supplements, nutritional supplements and medicine, has made it in and is being distributed. There's no clue or no publicity given to how that got in. But I think at some point, given the number of hungry and desperate people that there are in Venezuela, that the fact that these massive amounts of assistance are just sitting in warehouses on the border, people are going to start storming the border. And I would expect that to happen in fairly short order.
In spite of the Maduro administration's denials about there being a problem, a humanitarian problem, what do we know about how much suffering is actually taking place?
There's tremendous suffering. There are even statistics about the average amount of weight that Venezuelans have lost over the last 2 years because of the shortages of food and medicine. Something like 3 million people, that's the figure that's been used now since last November, have left the country in the last 4 or 5 years. The bulk of them now in Colombia. And these are people who are not looking necessarily to migrate, but are doing it simply out of desperation. So we know that there are communicable diseases that had been eradicated that are now present in Venezuela, that there is malnutrition of children, particularly young children under the age of 5, and that humanitarian workers are having an enormously difficult time in the current circumstances.
Are the U.S. sanctions more likely to hurt the government or the people?
Well, I think this is the big fear. The U.S. sanctions are going to collapse a collapsed economy even more. Oil production is way down to about 1.2 million barrels a day at the end of the year, probably way less than half of what it was just a few years ago. And it's really the only source of revenue for the Venezuelan government. The United States was the largest purchaser and the largest source of cash for the Venezuelan government. So there are still, although again it's scant, there are still government subsidized food programs with which Chavismo has bought popular loyalty for a long time. Those programs are going to feel the impact. I think the suffering is going to increase, at least in the short term. But there are other people who argue that no, the people who are really going to be affected are the heads of PDVSA, the state oil company, and President Maduro and his cronies, who are the ones that have been just siphoning off the wealth from the state oil company. I'm not sure it's quite that simple. It's probably a little bit of both, but I think undeniably there will be an increased pressure internally.
Is Maduro receiving much support from China, Russia? It's a small list of allies, but there are people or nations out there that are still supporting his government.
Right. I would distinguish between political support and economic or military support. Political support, exactly the countries that you mentioned, China, Russia, Cuba, Turkey, that are opposed to U.S. sponsored or U.S. promoted regime change. They are against people putting pressure on other governments for human rights, for democracy, for any of those kinds of things. In terms of economic support, China has already made it clear in the last year or two that it is only willing to roll over loans. It's not providing new money. It's enormously exposed, something like $62 billion in lending to both Maduro and to Hugo Chavez, but it's really changed over the last few years. And what China really seems to be most interested in is that over time, those loans get repaid in oil. Russia is in a different situation. I think Venezuela is a political ally for Vladimir Putin. There's a lot of Russian credibility that would be lost as a global power, as a power that has stood up to the United States and shown that this is not a unipolar world. and is providing some amounts of economic assistance, but really can't afford it. And the state-owned, or the partially state-owned oil company Rosneft, the Russian company, has been buying up a lot of assets of PDVSA's, but no one is really in much of a position to provide the government with cash. And then Turkey comes into the equation because it's been able to help market Venezuelan gold. And that's a source of foreign exchange. But really the options are extremely limited, and Cuba, of course, providing military and intelligence support, the scope of which is alleged by a lot of people to be huge. It's very hard to get a real handle on the dimensions of that.
In recent days, the standoff over humanitarian aid has dominated the headlines. But before that, we were hearing quite a few reports about Juan Guaido's attempts to reach out to the military or to other nations. Israel was one of the most recent. We heard about attempts to overtures toward Israel. What do we know about that type of effort, and is support for Maduro eroding in some of these key institutions like the military?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. So far, there have been a few notable defections, people who mostly, for the most part, do not command troops, who have separated from the regime and announced and called on people to support the democratic government. But there are so far no really huge visible cracks in the armed forces.
And that would be the tipping point.
That would absolutely mark the end of this regime. They have not broken with Maduro. The offers of amnesty might feel sufficient to some people, or probably not sufficient to the most senior commanders. Venezuela has one of the largest classes of generals in the entire world. These are members of the military that control the key sectors of the economy, control the oil industry, control food distribution, and also control a vast criminal enterprise that is involved in trafficking of drugs and all kinds of other things. So there's a lot that these people have to lose. And right now, I think that Maduro has even lost a good deal of the support that he had in the poorest barrios in big cities. People just are suffering that much, and he's lost the streets for the most part. But until he
Major
loses,
protests taking place
today. Again, the opposition has called for protests against the regime's refusal to allow this humanitarian aid in. Now, one thing I would say, though, is that the politicization of the issue of humanitarian aid, I think, is extremely dangerous in the short, medium, and long term. There are humanitarian organizations that have operated in Venezuela under enormous restrictions and under great duress, but have been able to continue functioning by carefully
and the threat is that they won't be able to.
Well, once humanitarian aid is seen as a political ploy of the opposition, supported by the United States and other governments that want to overthrow the Maduro regime, it becomes very complicated for those people to work on the ground. Exactly.
And help me with the pronunciation. One of the President's National Security Council senior directors, Mauricio Claver Caron.
Correct.
Did I get close?
You got it.
He said recently there's not a single scenario in which Nicolás Maduro and his cronies are able to retain power in Venezuela. Is that wishful thinking, or is that where the trend lines are headed?
Well, you would think that with the amount of economic collapse in the country, the amount of mismanagement, corruption, now the oil sanctions, the inability of Venezuela to quickly pivot to find cash, the fact that the opposition has this new fresh face that has united people, behind him. You'd think that, and that the support in the poor base of Chavismo has eroded, that this would be a recipe for regime collapse. But we've seen in other parts of the world, unfortunately, that people who are intent on clinging to power, regardless of how much suffering it causes their own citizens. Think of Assad in Syria, that as long as the military is willing to hang with this man, Nicolás Maduro, it's going to be very hard to see.
Would the end of
change.
Maduro be the end of Chavismo?
It certainly would not be the end of Chavismo. There is a political movement that may, at this point in time, represent a minority of public opinion that would almost undoubtedly lose a free and fair election, but which is nonetheless an important political force, and which is a force that will have to be accommodated, whether in the short term as part of a transition government or over the long term as one of many political currents in Venezuela.
Cindy, I know you're in the business of serious analysis and not wild speculation, but let me ask you a speculative question before we close, which is, how long can a situation like this go on? You mentioned Assad in Syria. That's a particular, and that has seen military intervention from multiple foreign nations. What do you see happening here as far as how long can this be a chronic set of circumstances where it doesn't move to an acute stage?
I would say it's already in an acute stage. I am surprised, actually, that Maduro has lasted for a month. It's been about a month
pressure's that great.
Since Juan Guaido has announced himself interim president, has received the backing of dozens of countries throughout Latin America, Europe, the United States, Canada. There's all of these offers of humanitarian assistance, which says if this government changes, it sends a signal to the Venezuelan public that relief is around the corner. If those things were not sufficient to topple the regime or to cause a palace coup, it's not clear what will be. But I think that the combination of this ongoing suffering and the ability of people to get aid into Venezuela very discreetly, it's a long, uncontrolled border, not only with Colombia, but also with Brazil, that there will be ways to get the aid in and to send the message that that the opposition is the key to this aid. But again, the key in all of this is what, if any, cracks will develop within the armed forces.
Cindy, thank you for that excellent briefing on the situation. And
My pleasure.
It's a moving target, so I'm sure we'll be speaking again.
Great. Thanks so much, Tim.
Thanks to all of you for joining us as well. Hope you enjoyed it and that you'll join us again for another edition of Wilson Center Now. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.